Okay, so we dedicate, everybody hear me okay on there? Great. All right, we dedicate our Chazara tonight to Nishmas Yaakov Elimelech ben Avraham Abba. Mr. Nagel's third yahrzeit is this Shabbos. And so we have his memory fondly in mind. All right, here we are. Right, it all comes down to this. Right? The last review for the Bechina. This is pretty unrealistic. I think even I will admit that I think this is an overly ambitious goal to try to get through everything tonight. But Torah is all about being overly ambitious sometimes. And I heard a beautiful thing. Maybe till Zman Kriya Shema. I heard a nice thing. Somebody was quoting from a Talmud went to his Rebbe. He said, Rebbe, what's one thing that you recommend I could take upon myself for this coming year to really try to do well? And the Rebbe looked at him and said, why one thing? Go for everything. In Torah, we're ambitious. We aim high. And so with that, we'll try our best. I'm going to go very quickly. But obviously, if we go too quickly to the point that nobody's understanding anything, then it defeats the purpose. So hopefully we'll find a balance. Let me know if it's not making sense. And I'll ask that we please hold questions unless it's something directly related to just understanding Pshat. But any sorts of application or other types of questions on the WhatsApp or otherwise we can do afterwards. Okay, so with that, we're going to jump in. Did everybody get the review sheets that I sent up the question? So we're going to go through these. And I'll put them out to the crowd also to help us stay awake. So Siman Shin Beis. Number 1, is Malabin an Av or a Tolda? So remember, we said Malabin is an Av. Malabin classically means laundering, bleaching fleece, bleaching wool. That's going to be the Av. What about Kibbutz, according to the Rambam? Laundering garments. So not wool, but garments, that we said is a Tolda. Is there any nafkamina between an Av and a Tolda nowadays? According to most opinions, there's no difference if it's an Av or a Tolda. They're both Daraisa, but it's still not for Korbanot purpose. Okay. 2, is one ever allowed to apply water to a stain on cloth on Shabbos? Josh says, no, you're totally right. Never allowed to put water on a stain. That's absolutely going to be a daraisa malabin. Okay, what about when it comes to something that's not wet? Let's say I have dust on my clothes. I don't want to shake it off. What was the machlokes? Rashi, Tosfos, and Shulchan Aruch in the Ramah. So we said Rashi was machmir. Rashi said that even if there's dry cleaning, you just have dust on your jacket, you want to brush it off or dust it off, that's a form of cleaning. That's a malacha da'araisa. And Tosfos is lo hayu devar me'olam, that dusting off, that's not a daraisa. Daraisa laundering always involves putting liquid on your suit jacket to clean it. To just dust it off wouldn't be. And we saw that Sfardim and Ashkenazim ad hayom hazeh disagree about this. That the Sfardim are more lenient on that. The Ashkenazim are more machmir, like the opinion of Rashi. Okay, number 4. Yeah, he says that that's no problem. You have to apply water to it in order for it to be malabin daraisa generally. Okay, according to the Gemara in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, what are the 3 requirements to permit shaking out a garment on Shabbos? And how do other Ashkenazi poskim rule? So remember, we said this was based on the Gemara. That the Gemara said, if you're going to be machmir and say that dusting off your black suit jacket is the araisa on Shabbos, that's a form of laundering it, we said there have to be 3 requirements. Everybody remember? The acronym we gave, I think at the time, was BUM, B-U-M. So it should be black, unused, and makpi. So it's a black jacket. It's a new jacket that's barely been used. Doesn't have to be the first time, but it's still very new. And I mind having this dust on my jacket. If those 3 criteria are there, then Rashi would say that it's a malacha da'araisa to brush it off. But if it's a white, M is makpid. Like you mind it, yeah, mind in English. Very good. But we said that other Ashkenazi poskim are not as lenient, right? Because how often are you going to get that? That I have a black jacket that's brand new that I care about. That's not going to be very common. But so the Ashkenazi poskim, the other ones, the Shemir Shabbos, the Aruch HaShulchan, the way most poskim other than Chabad, is that no, anytime it's just one criterion. If you have dust on your jacket and you're makpid, you mind it, that makes it a malacha da'araisa. So remember, here we're only talking about what we call the dry cleaning during the shear, where you're dusting off. If we're talking about putting water on, it's always prohibited, whether I mind it, whether I don't. But when we're talking about this debated category of laundry, which is dry substances, then if I care about it, I wouldn't want to go out wearing this, then I'm not allowed to do it. If I don't care and I'd go out with it anyways, then I'm allowed to do it. Okay, number 5. Are there ever any heterim for Ashkenazim to dust off clothes if one is embarrassed? Let's say you have, powder got onto your jacket on the way to shul, you're the gabbai, you're going to be very embarrassed. Are you ever allowed to dust it off if you're Ashkenazi? So for Sephardim, is there any problem? Sephardim would say it's okay. But for Ashkenazim, is there any problem? Any heter? Very good. So Mishnah Berurah says, if you're very embarrassed about it, ask someone who's not Jewish to do it. Normally, we don't allow you to ask a non-Jew to do malacha. What? A non-Jew, the Mishnah Berurah says. But then we saw the Mizgeres HaShulchan, is the commentary on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We saw, remember, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch didn't want any commentaries written, but the Mizgeres HaShulchan wrote out anyways. And he said that if you're very embarrassed and there's no non-Jew around, we'll even let you dust off your jacket yourself. That's a little bit controversial, but there are those who say it because he says to begin with, ask any Sephardic Jew, he'll tell you there's nothing wrong in the first place. You're not applying water here. This is malabin. Malabin means you take water to clean it off. If you're just dusting it off dry, there's nothing to begin with. Number 6, is an Ashkenazi Jew allowed to dust items like salt, sugar, or dandruff, let's say off their suit jacket? So he said that that would be okay. What about snow? Anybody remember?
As long as it's not melted.
Yeah, if it's early, if it's dry, you're okay with it. And they're really good. What was that, Adam? Yeah, we generally assume, remember, the classic example is if you have a feather on your jacket, the Rama says, everybody agrees that's not laundering to take that off because it's external, it's not embedded in the fibers. But if you have like powder that's mamish in the fibers and you really have to hit it hard, that's going to be laundering. But if it's something that's purely on the surface, so for our purposes like salt or sugar, and many poskim say even dandruff, that's totally superficial, you can just easily flick it off, that's like a feather rather than powder or dust. Yeah, because then it's wet. Okay. How do we define makbid for purposes of brushing off dust from garments? Right, so what's the definition of, we said you're only not allowed to brush off dust if you're makbid, if you mind it. What does it mean I mind it? I don't like it a little bit, I don't like it a lot. What's the litmus test? Very good. So that's one of the Reb Shlomo Zalman said is, would you go out with it during the week or not, as opposed to on Shabbos? Let's say on Shabbos, I like my clothes to be extra clean, but during the week, I don't care. So Reb Shlomo Zalman said that that's okay. You go based on the weekday standard. But the basic standard is, would I go out with this or not? So if I'm embarrassed enough that I have powder on my suit jacket, on my black suit jacket, that I wouldn't go out with it, I would change it. Well, then that means halachically, I'm not allowed to dust it off. If it's something I'd go out, it's not a big deal, then I'm actually allowed to dust it off because it's not called improving it, since I don't care in the first place about it. Okay. Okay, number 8. Okay, what do you do? Let's say there's a cholent stain on your shirt. Or is there anything that you can do according to the Shulchan Aruch and according to the Ramah? Where's the job? Exactly. So Shulchan Aruch says you can totally scratch it off. Just don't take the garment and rub it on itself, because that's really an active laundry. Remember, that's the exception, or even the Sephardim, even the Shulchan Aruch says, even though there's no water being applied, we're still going to call that an active laundering because it resembles laundering so much. But when it comes to a fingernail or anything, you can totally scratch off a dry stain according to the Sephardim. According to the Ashkenazim, we saw that you want to leave behind a little bit of the stain. You shouldn't fully improve it. Or the second option is if it's a stain that doesn't really bother you, it's somewhere on your shirt that you wouldn't even really notice, then you're allowed to totally clean it with your nail. Are you allowed to apply water to it if you're not makbid? Exactly. Always remember, water is always not allowed on Shabbos to be applied on any stain. Okay. Yeah, don't take the material and rub it on itself together. That's considered the way that the launderers do it. Okay, number 9, what additional potential malacha? We're talking about dry stain. So let's say somebody has some dried mud on their shirt. Tochen, exactly. If you crumble it off, you're grinding it. And the Shulchan Aruch says that could be a problem as well. And so the Shulchan Aruch paskins, L'chomer, and the Shmir Shabbos Tilchas also says for Ashkenazim should be machmir for that this is an act of tochen. But it says it only is called tochen or grinding if it's something that comes from the ground. Right? That's how we paskin. It's machlokas rishonim. We hold tochen, it only applies and you do like arka. So mud comes from the ground, that could be a problem. But if it's something that was already ground up before, or it didn't come from the ground, then by you scratching it off, you're going to be crumbling it up. That's not called grinding. Grinding is only for something that grows from the ground, at least for these purposes. Okay? Yeah, also machmir. Saying not to, yeah. They say, that on the dirt. Did I get that wrong? Okay, Shulchan Aruch is machmir, but he brings it there that's machmir. But then I think it could be that the Yalkut Yosef says you can go l'kula. Maybe does he say if it's only gedulei karka, or does it say for everything? Okay, Darashinu Miskaven. That's right. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So he says you don't have to be machmir at all. Very good. Thank you for that. Okay, let's keep going. Number 10. What are the opinions of the Rabbeinu Tam and the Areim regarding soaking a garment on Shabbos? So remember we said, are there any heterim? Normally you're not allowed to soak anything in water on Shabbos. You can't take a cloth, a thing, and dunk it in because you're laundering it. Just by putting it in water, that very act is called, what's that called in Hebrew? Shriya, right? Shriya sozu kibuso. Are there any heterim for that? So remember the Rabbeinu Tam and the Areim? So the says that if it's something that's already clean, then you're not cleaning it. You can put a cloth that's clean into water because that soaking is not considered laundering it because it was already clean. We saw that the Shulchan Aruch brings that means. But yeah, we're gonna get excellent. That'll be relevant for that. Exactly. Rabbeinu Tam says that exactly. So if you're wetting it, but it makes it dirty, it's not an act of cleaning; it's an act of dirtying. Then that would be okay. Yeah, lichluch means dirty, so derech lichluch, the manner of dirtying. And then we saw the Areim says even if you're making it dirty, it's still going to be prohibited. Right, so 3 different opinions. Sfardim are generally the most lenient. They rule like the Rabbeinu Tam, the Ashkenazim generally rely on Rabbeinu Tam that if it's derech lichluch, if you're wetting it in a way that makes it dirty, then that's going to be okay. So that was a heter, for example, as Dr. Nagel said, what about a water fight on Shabbos? Is there any problem? So we said, technically, is that going to be a biblical prohibition? If I take a bucket of water and throw it on someone, why not? I'm laundering their suit jacket. I just put water on it. Isn't that Torah prohibition? Derech lichluch. We said if you're wearing it, the Shulchan Aruch Harav said that if you're wearing it, that always will be called derech lichluch because nobody washes their clothes while they're wearing it. That makes it dirty in your mind. Okay. In addition to the biblical prohibition of soaking, what rabbinic prohibition is violated when you completely soak a garment?
Shechita?
Exactly, schita, exactly, that there's a concern you might come to wring it out. And that we said is still going to be a problem with a water fight on Shabbos. So even though a water fight on Shabbos doesn't violate a biblical prohibition because you're making their jacket dirty, their shirt dirty by pouring water, it still will violate a rabbinic prohibition because by saturating it with water, you're actually making it that they may come to wring it out, and that would be a problem. We said though, what about paper towels? Remember? Moshe said paper towels you don't have to worry about. Nobody wrings out paper towels. And so therefore, if you have a spill on Shabbos, taking paper towels and putting it on it is going to be totally fine. Aren't I laundering them? So we say, no, you're not laundering it because it makes it dirty rather than cleaning. And what about the rabbinic prohibition? If I might come to squeeze it out? But that too, you're not, because with paper towels, nobody does that. Okay. Number 12, is one permitted to soak leather on Shabbos? Yes. What? Very good. So Adam gives us the way to remember. If you're ever cleaning your shoes on Shabbos, we said you want to pour water on your Shabbos shoes, assuming you have laced shoes, pour water on the leather, but don't pour water on the lace because the lace is fabric. You're not allowed to pour water on fabric. We've said many times on Shabbos, but leather you're allowed to pour water on. You're just not allowed to do what? To scrub it down. Okay. What about hard plastic dishes? Is there any problem of no, there we assume that totally exempt, right? So like dishes in the sink are not subject to malaben. What about the soft plastic tablecloth cover? So that we said you should treat it like leather. Reb Moshe said, why? Yeah, so you're allowed to pour water on it, but you may not scrub it down. You can wipe it gently. So pour water on the plastic tablecloth cover and wipe it down, treat it like leather. Why? He said, in theory, maybe you should be allowed to do it completely, to even scrub it down. But because this is a new material, and it's not really like a dish, it's not hard like a plastic bowl or something in your sink. Therefore, they treat it like a cloth a little bit, that we're not going to fully open the floodgates to allow malabim. But the soaking, you can pour water on it, but we say don't scrub it down. Don't do the second phase of kibbutz, of laundering. Okay, how does one handle a spill on a tablecloth on Shabbos? Did I skip? Oh, 13. Which two avos malachos may wringing out a towel violate? Malaben and which one? Mefarek, exactly. Squeezing out, which is a told of dash, which we saw later. Okay, and then how does one handle a spill on a tablecloth on Shabbos? The main thing here to remember is you don't want to be pushing down, right? Regardless, we made a distinction when we learned between a soft surface, a hard surface. It's really kind of the same thing. If you put down a paper towel with them, you don't want to be pushing down because you don't want to be expelling liquid from. Yeah, so you just put it down gently and wipe it, rather than if you're pushing it down, you're going to cause liquid to be expelled from the cloth, which is a problem. We said paper towel is the best because there you avoid even the secondary rabbinic prohibition of maybe you'll wring it out. But even a towel would probably be okay as long as you don't fully saturate it. We're not afraid you're going to wring it out. Okay, is one allowed to use the sponge on Shabbos? No, right? What's the problem with the sponge? It's mepharik, right? You're squeezing out, extracting water from a substance. What if they squeeze it out while it's under the water? We talked about it, right? Josh says still no. Why not? Because what? Shema Yisrael, you might come to actually squeeze it out. So if I have a wet sponge and I squeeze it and the water is coming out, that's like squeezing grape, right? That's extracting the water from the sponge. It's not allowed, we said. But even if I put it under the water, remember this one, if you put it under the water, you still are not allowed to squeeze it out because we're afraid you might come to squeeze otherwise. Okay. What is a Shabbos brush sponge? Anybody remember how that gets around the problem? Those Shabbos brushes that you. Exactly. So it's made out of synthetic fibers that aren't going to really absorb, and the fibers are separated. If you have fibers that are close together, like in a toothbrush, we said, it looks like you're extracting, right? It looks like the water is stuck in between the bristles and it's coming out, it's being pressed out. That could be what? Maybe, but if you make it like leather that doesn't absorb and it's spaced out far enough, then water is not getting embedded in it and you're not going to have a problem. Okay, so that was parenthetical. We said that Reb Moshe is machmir about that in terms of a wet toothbrush to use. There are other shitos on it, many different. It's a whole shir in and of itself about a toothbrush on Shabbos. But the reason to be one of the reasons. I try not to use a toothbrush, actually finger, but flossing is okay. Flossing is okay as long as you know you're not gonna bleed. What? If you know you're not gonna bleed. Yeah, well, if you say last night, the night before I didn't bleed, it's likely I'm not going to bleed. Meaning, as long as it's not a degradation. If you always bleed, then it's a problem. Okay, let's keep going. If one is allowed to walk in a sach, it's lo nechav, it's still aser d'Rabbanan. Exactly. You're right. Is one allowed? What? Yeah, it could be a significant need. There are reasons to be lenient also on Shabbos. There are those who are making, but we could talk about it. Is one allowed to walk on a saturated wet doormat on a rainy Shabbos? Josh says, yes, why? Well, aren't you squeezing out by walking on it? You're expelling liquid? So exactly, either it gets reabsorbed or it's not derech malabin. This isn't the way that you're doing it, you're not intending. But we said if possible, you should try to walk around. Okay, what malacha might be violated by using baby wipes on Shabbos? So is that malabin? When the liquid comes out of the wipe, is that a problem of schita mishum malabin, that you're laundering the wipe? Exactly. We said it's not laundering because it's going to become dirty, but it is still extracting. Just like you can't squeeze a berry to get the juice, if you squeeze a baby wipe and that liquid comes out of it, and you're applying it, the liquid comes out, isn't that a form of squeezing liquids, right? Of what we talked about at the end of this month, mefarek. So we said, what was a heter for that? Why might we be lenient to say it's not a problem of extracting the cleaning?
Liquid's on the surface.
It's on the surface, exactly. Rav Asher Weiss said he did research on it and he found that they're not really absorbed, that the way they function is that the liquid is sitting on top of the baby wipe rather than being in it. So you're just removing it from the top rather than extracting it from being embedded within. We also
wouldn't it also be because it's like disgusting?
Well, you're right. That could be a heter for a d'Rabbanan potentially of a kavod abrios. Absolutely, that could be another factor. But here we might have a Torah prohibition, and if it's a Torah prohibition, then we wouldn't allow it for kavod. But great point, Joey, as well. Absolutely, good worth thinking about. Okay, great. Is one allowed? Very cool. One allowed to remove lint balls from a suit on Shabbos? Did I remember that one? Very good. It could be from a makil patish. What if you just take one? No, yeah, you're not allowed to. So I said, even if you don't take them all, it still could be a problem. Okay, is one allowed to remove a suit tag on Shabbos? Let's say a plastic suit tag. Are you allowed to cut that off? So I said, yes, that's not makeh b'patish, it's not korea, you're allowed to do it. What about a tag that's stitched into the garment? There we said that could be more of a problem potentially. Korea, which based on some of the nuances of the various malachos. What could be the potential problem of folding a garment on the crease on Shabbos? is mataken mana, right? That maybe folding your talit, if you like makib patish, right? That you're finishing the garment, that you're folding it on the creases. That's perfecting it, right? In the olden times, they would do that to smooth out all the creases. There was a form of like ironing the garment. So said maybe that's like a makib patish. You've just sort of perfected it. You fixed it. But is there any room to be lenient to fold your talis or your other garments on the creases? Why? We don't do it anymore. Maybe that's what the Aruch HaShulchan says. That's talking, bringing the kolbo, exactly. Maybe that was talking about their old garments, the way they used to do it. Now we just fold it to keep it organized. We're not doing an act of ironing by folding them. And what about draping pants over a chair? Is there any problem with draping it on the crease? Then that's okay. That as well. We said you're not actually doing 6 feet. So that could be a problem. That could be a problem. Okay, let's move, if that's okay, to Timin Shinya Dalet. I know we're going really fast. Is it okay, the pace? We're getting it? Okay, yeah. Great. Shinya Dalet, let's go. What are the 6 potential prohibitions that could be violated when you open a package on Shabbos? These we should know in the middle of the night. If somebody wakes you up, what are the 6 potential things?
Bonair.
Yes, the building, destroying, Bonair Soser, and then Makib Asiyas Pesach, Makib Patish, very good. Mechatech, Korea, and Mochek, exactly. So you can kind of break them up into 3 and 3, right? They're kind of 2 groups of 3. That Boneh, Soser, and Makib Patish are all related types of malachot. And then the other 3 of Korea, Mechatech, and Mochek are all related as well. So you can remember it that way. Okay, what is a mustiki? Daf Yomi, I think, right? People are learning Daf Yomi must have just covered this.
It's a weak barrel.
A weak barrel, a nebach kli. We said you have a barrel that's all shattered and you take some gum to stick it together. It's one step away from being broken, from falling apart on its own. It's a nebach kli. And which malachos don't apply to that? What are you allowed to do according to everybody?
Bonair and Soser.
Bonair and Soser. You can picture, you can imagine in your mind like that weak barrel, and like imagine a hammer just coming and smashing. That's totally fine to do. No malacha is violated. Okay, what about Asiyas Pesach? Are you allowed to make an opening in a barrel like that? That we said is still a problem. Okay, what are choslos? Those are the palm branch baskets, right? Date branch, exactly, where you can put around dates. And that we said you're allowed to rip open on Shabbos because they're so insignificant. They're not even a kli. So we have 3 layers. Everybody remember this. The first layer is the real kli, right? Like an actual box of a permanent box. The second is mustiki, which is a very weak, falling apart box, but it still is a box. It still is a kli. And then the third level is not even called a kli. It's a wrapper, like a shell, choslo. Okay, can Korea ever apply to choslos? We said that choslos have a leniency. You're allowed to rip them on Shabbos. Is there ever a situation where you're not allowed to rip them on Shabbos, according to anybody? So exactly. The Aruch HaShabbos is if you're tearing it in a meaningful way, in a productive sort of way, then even choslos are going to be a problem. Well, that will come up again and again. Okay, so describe the problem of Asiyas Pesach. So very briefly, it means you're not allowed to make what Rashi calls a Pesach Naya, a nice opening, a functional opening that is able to remove and to put in. What type of opening does this include? So we said it has to be a daraisa if things are put in and taken out, drabanan if it's even unidirectional. Which type of utensils are subject to Asiyas Pesach? Remember, we said Asiyas Pesach is the most dangerous. It's one of the most dangerous of the malachos. It applies even to a mustiki. So if I have this nebach barrel that's going to be falling apart, and can I drill a hole in it to make a nice hole for the spigot? Absolutely not. What about if I have choslos? I have something that's it's not even a kli. Am I allowed to make a pesach in it? So even there it applies. Rav David Feinstein proved from Rav Moshe that it applies there. Okay. Does completely removing the top of a barrel violate Asiyas Pesach? No, exactly. That's not a nice opening. That's not meant to be used and reused like a spigot. It's purely just functional, yanking the whole top off. Okay, do Boneh and Soser apply to kalim? If I'm not allowed to break down a house, that's a Torah prohibition if I break it down in order to rebuild. What if I break down a kli? Right? Am I allowed to break a hammer on Shabbos? So I said it depends on machlokas or Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi says categorically it doesn't apply, and Tosfos says there are situations where it really could still apply if it's a full-fledged kli that you're making. Does Korea apply to all materials? Are there any exceptions? So we saw ripping, tearing does not apply to everything, right? It only applies, Minchas Chinuch said, to soft materials, right? Like cloth, like what they used in the Mishkan. But something hard like metal would not be subject to Korea. What about machatech, precise cutting? Does that apply to metal and all materials? Yes, the machatech does. Okay, describe the potential problems with opening a tuna can on Shabbos. So remember, we said the Tila David says it might be a problem of soser because you had a great kli, a great tuna can, and now you just ruined it. You just destroyed it by opening it. The Chazon Ish said the opposite. He said you're not destroying it. Beforehand, there was nothing. Now, when you remove the top, you just gave life to it. You gave birth to a kli because now you have a great tuna can that you can keep your pennies in, that you could store things in. You just made a kli. That's the opposite. This is Borair. The Tehillah David. What about any other possible issues? So Asiyas Pesach, is there a problem with making a nice opening with the tuna can? So we say generally we don't assume that, right? Because it's it's not precisely cut for then you're just yanking the whole top off. Also, if you're going to be throwing out the tuna can, that helps mitigate the problem of Asiyas Pesach. Okay, what about mechatech? We'll get to that in a second. Excellent. What about any other problems? So machatech, is there a problem? Korea, we said no problem because it's metal. What about machatech? So yeah, Rav Yashiv said that if you have a pull tab, that's a problem because that's going to make a very precise cut of exactly the same opening every time. That's called precise cutting machatech. What was the argument against that?
You don't care.
You don't care. Yeah, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said you're just pulling it off and it comes off however it will. As long as it opens, that's all you care about. There's no machatech. Okay, and then mochek, we said wouldn't really be an issue there. Okay, and then what about puncturing the base? Mochek, erasing, because there's no writing at that part. What about the base of a tuna can? Why did we say, according to everyone or most people, if you puncture the bottom first, then you could open it? Because now, you avoid the bone net problem because before it can even be born, you've already destroyed it, so to speak. So now when you're opening it, you, in a very clever way, circumvented that problem. Okay, number 7, what potential issues may arise with opening a tuna can, a soda can on Shabbos? So all the issues we said before, is there going to be a problem of Asiyas Pesach? So some say there is, but we generally assume not, because it's going to be thrown out. Right? Like Asiyas Pesach, we said, means to create a functional opening that you plan to reuse. The soda can is usually very short-lived, so there's not going to be an Asiyas Pesach problem according to many poskim. But we said there is clearly one problem for Rabbi Yashiv, which is mechatech. Right? Why is it mechatech? Because you're precise cutting, right? When you open the metal, there's a precise cut that's made. There are pre-set lines, and that would be a problem, he thought. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says you are allowed to open soda cans on Shabbos because there's no issue of mechatech, right? You don't care about the exact size. 8, what is the dispute between Rabbi Shlomo Zalman and Rabbi Yashiv? We talked about this with machatech that comes up repeatedly. We said Rabbi Yashiv says anytime you do precise cutting, that is called machatech. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman says no, it's only if it's precise cutting that you want. So you're making a wood project and you measure out the exact length and you cut it there. Yeah, that's machatech. But opening up a soda can, you didn't measure that out. You couldn't care less exactly how big or how small it is. You just, so exactly. It has to be something that you care about specifically. And what are some examples? So we saw the tuna pull tab was one. Soda cans is another. Orange juice pull tabs, we said, was another. Is it Rabbi Yashiv thought that's machatech when you pull out the ring tab because you're precise cutting the top? Separating attached yogurt cups from each other, is that machatech when you break them apart? And toilet paper as well. Number 9, what is the dispute between Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Orchot Shabbos regarding opening milk cartons on Shabbos? Anybody remember what was Rav Moshe Machmir for with opening a milk carton at the spout?
Asiyas Pesach.
Asiyas Pesach, exactly. You're making a nice opening. That's like the definition of like a nice functional spout that you can pour with. So that he said would be a real problem. What's the argument why it shouldn't be Asiyas Pesach? Oh, very good. So that's for Korea, exactly. That's why it wouldn't be a Korea problem. Shabbat said is it's not ripping if it was meant to be ripped in the first place. Excellent. But then exactly. Then maybe it's already considered open and it was just temporarily sealed. It never negated the original opening when they first filled it up in the factory, perhaps. And others say, no, what are you talking about? It's sealed. Reb Moshe says it's tight. You were mavatel that opening, and now when you make a spout, you're making a new opening.
So Moshe said no.
Yeah, he says you're not allowed to open milk cartons on Shabbos the normal way. What about if you were to cut them like at the top, like in the middle? They take a knife and slice open an opening there. So there, even Reb Moshe would seemingly be okay, right? Because you're not making a nice opening. It's not functional in any way, and there's no Korea problem because we've seen repeatedly the Chazon Ish, Korea is allowed if you're breaking something destructively to access the contents inside. Okay. Good. Is one allowed to open? So we said milk cartons. How did Rav Scheinberg dismiss a problem of Korea? That was what Sam said. Rav Scheinberg said there's no Korea problem when you make a spout for a milk carton because it was meant to be opened in the first place. That's not called Korea. It was meant to be undone. Okay. What are the potential problems of opening a milk bag on Shabbos? How could you be lenient? So the big one, is it going to be a Borair or a Soser problem? Clearly not, right? It's mustaki or choslos even, but certainly not the real kli. What about a asiyas pesach? So that we said was probably going to be one of the big concerns, right, of asiyas pesach. So how did we get around that?
Small hole.
Exactly. If you make the opening not nice, you make it in a way that it's not going to be purely functional. So during the week, I'd cut it right over here, so I get a nice stream of milk. I'll cut it smaller, so it's really kind of dripping out the milk. That's not called a functional opening. Additionally, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, remember, making a nice opening only applies if it's something you're going to use and reuse repeatedly. But if it's something that's very quickly going to be thrown out, that undoes this malacha. It's a great kula for a very serious malacha. And so you always want to keep that in your back pocket. So if you open the milk and you pour it all out quickly, like in a yeshiva, he gave the example where like everybody's pouring it out in 5 seconds, it's gone at the table, that would be okay also to get around the problem of Pilas Pesach. Okay, so that was the big issue there. And then Korea also, we could say it's choslos, right? And destructive tearing for choslos, if we allow. You just have to be careful about the writing, right? Not to cut the writing if you're Ashkenaz. Yeah, that's one of the asiyas pesach, making an opening, is another word. I'm sorry if it's confusing for makeh b'patish. Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry. Yeah. So asiyas pesach, making an opening means you're finalizing the opening, by making that hole. Okay. What about opening a bag of chips on Shabbos? Am I allowed to? So, yeah, very good. So, well, first, if it's a small bag of chips, so is there a problem of Borair or soter? I'm making a kli, I'm destroying a kli. No, it's flimsy. That's not anything. So there's no problem of building or destroying, even to those who are machmir by a tuna can. A rigid tuna can, maybe you're building, but a little bag of chips, you're not building. We said Rav Moshe had a tshuva on that. But then what about making an opening? Am I making a functional opening? So we said, again, if it's an opening that's going to get thrown in the garbage 10 seconds later, or however long later, but still very soon later, that's not called making an opening. Making an opening is like I have a big barrel, what? Yeah, exactly, same kula as the milk bag. If I have a big barrel and I'm a bartender and I'm making a hole in the barrel to put in a spigot that I'm going to be using for the next week for customers, that's called making an opening. But making an opening in a bag of chips that you're going to throw out, we said is not going to be a problem. What if it's a big bag of chips, like a party size that you aren't going to be throwing out right away? It's going to last you for a week. So there we said another convenient way to avoid, which was what Adam said, was if you just rip the whole thing open at the top. That's not making a precise functional opening. That would be considered all right. Same thing with a cereal bag, by the way, right? We said if you have a cereal bag and you make a nice opening in the corner like you normally would so you can pour the cereal out, that could be a problem because the cereal will likely last you for a good week. But if you open it and you're going to get rid of all the cereal right away, that's one kula to avoid the problem of making an opening. Or two, if you open it all the way, so then now when you pour it, it goes all over the place. It gets inside the box itself. That would not violate asiyas. Remember, making an opening, makeh b'patish, always means it's a nice functional opening, not just any stama opening. Okay, number 12. Is one allowed to tear open the plastic foil covering of a wine bottle on Shabbos, right? The safety seal. So we said yes. I think the biggest question people would have, of course, there's no bona, of course, there's no soser, of course, there's no pesach that you're making. What? So mochek, exactly, you have to be careful of that. There could be, letters that you want to be careful about not to rip through. And two would be if there's perforation, I might think that that's a problem of memachek, right? Of precise cutting. Why is it not? Why even Rav Elyashiv be lenient? You're throwing it right out. Even Rav Elyashiv, who's the big machmir when it comes to memachek, he says to mechatech, I'm sorry, not memachek, to precise cutting. He holds that if you're throwing it away 2 seconds later, this is a nothing. Even I agree that that's not called a malacha on Shabbos. Okay, so remember that. Or what are the potential problems with opening a box of matzah or a cereal box on Shabbos? And what about the plastic bag inside? So we kind of touched on the plastic bag already. It's the same thing as, let's say, a milk bag, right? Where when you make the opening, if it's a nice opening that allows for easy pouring, that could be a real problem, making an opening, a siyas pesach on Shabbos. But we said that there's leniencies for korea there because A, it's choslos, right? It's a very weak wrapping, and B, like Rav Scheinberg said, if it was meant to be open, maybe there's no problem with korea. But what about the box on the outside, right? The box of matzah, the cereal box. So is there any problem about siyas pesach there when I pull apart the tabs and now I have a nice opening that I can open and close? Why might that not be a problem of making a nice opening on Shabbos? Exactly. So remember we said this whole malacha that we have spent so much time talking about, you're not allowed to make an opening on Shabbos, a functional opening. That's only if you're making an opening, not exposing an opening. We said there's a big difference between a pre-existing opening that I'm just exposing. Let's say I have a cup of yogurt and I pull that top off. So I pull the paper top off, the foil top off the yogurt. It was already open, they just covered it up. But it was already an opening that existed, as opposed to like a milk bag where I'm ripping open something that was never open ever before. I'm creating that corner, that snip in the corner. That's called making an opening. Just revealing the top of a Pringles can, if I remove that top foil, I'm just exposing an opening that was there and merely covered up in the factory. That's not called making an opening, that's called exposing an opening. So same thing with a matzah box or the cereal box, it was already open and then they just folded it over. I'm just reopening it, re-exposing it, as opposed to surgically, ripping open something that was didn't exist before. Okay, so box of matzah, we said, or cereal box, there's room to be lenient by opening it, but we said Moshe might be machmir. Moshe from the milk carton, who said that just like the milk carton, he assumed that nullified the previous opening, and once they sealed it in the factory, it's like it no longer exists, and now you're reopening it. Maybe he'd say the same thing by cereal box. Oh, good to know. Not necessarily for the bechina, but in terms of Rabbi Yashiv saying that if something was glued together and you're separating it, that might be a form of the korea. Absolutely. Good question. So would we say machatech, precise cutting, by separating? Oh, so that could be a perforated tab that you pull off. That could potentially be an issue of machatech, right? Because you're ripping precisely on a perforation. For Rav Elayashi, that seemingly would be. For Rav Shlomo Zalman, he would say certainly not, right? Because you don't care if it's a clean cut, if it's not. But yeah, everybody here that for like those matzah boxes where you have to pull a tab. Okay, what are the 3 opinions we learned regarding opening bottle caps on Shabbos? Very quickly, either. Yeah, totally mutter according to Rav Ovadia Yosef, we said. Totally asur midaraisa, every bottle cap that you're breaking the ring on for Rav Asher Weiss. And the middle opinion of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who said a plastic cap would be allowed to break from the ring on Shabbos. It's not called creating a new cap, but a metal cap, you are actually creating a new kli of the metal cap of Tikkun Manat Maki B'Patish. How do Ashkenazim and Sephardim rule regarding eating letters on cake and ripping through letters on
Rabbi,
Shabbos?
so Rav Shel, the third one, what does he actually say in the end? Okay or not okay?
Yeah, he says that metal is not allowed, plastic is allowed. And that we said the day that tshuva came out was the day that Kedem grape juice changed from metal caps to plastic caps, because it said he sends waves through the from world with anything that he says. Okay, what do Ashkenazim and Sephardim rule regarding eating letters on cake and ripping through letters on Shabbos? Very briefly, so eating letters on cake, we said there certainly are grounds to be lenient for in the act of eating. Cutting, you want to try to avoid the letters, but more interesting for our purposes is what about ripping through letters on Shabbos, much more common shaila. So we said that the Shulchan Aruch for Sephardim is makil. Why? Because it's to begin with, destroying a letter on Shabbos, erasing, is a rabbinic prohibition. Why is it only rabbinic? Because it's only biblical if you erase with the intent to write 2 letters in the space that you erase. That's the definition. But for everybody, the definition of the biblical erasing on Shabbos is erasing with the intent to write more letters. But if I'm just ripping, I have no intent to rewrite anything in that space. So he says at worst, we're dealing with a rabbinic prohibition. And then it's a psik reisha on a rabbinic prohibition that you don't care about. He thought that for Sfardim, you could be lenient on ripping letters, but for Ashkenazim, we try to be machmir if we can to avoid cutting letters, because it is still a psik reisha on a derabanan that we try to be machmir for. But if one can't, or if it's for a choler, if it's a serious situation, there are heterim we saw.
Rabbi, why is it called like nichole? If he wants the items, why is it like nichole?
Cutting letters on a cake was a little different. Meaning, cutting letters there you want to cut in between the letters. We said certainly for and then you can eat whatever you want. Dan,
I was asking him, why is it called loy nichole? If you want a piece of cake, you have to cut it so that it is nichole. No.
Well, we're talking about with the packages, let's say. So when you rip open the packages, then that certainly would be lo necham, or at least lo ichbas, at least you don't care about. With the cake is an interesting shaila. Would that be different? Again, so by the cake, we say that there's two derabanan, right? Because it's a shin, you're doing it derech kilkul, and it's a shino. I mean, it's not amanas to write, and you're doing it in a strange way of erasing. So that we said was a kula for everybody. Okay. Next question, is one allowed to plunge a toilet on Shabbos? So we said Rosh Hashanah and Arbach here was nakil. He says you're not fixing, it's not broken, you're just removing an obstruction. Or Vavad, he thought, no, we labeled the toilet as broken, and he thought that you really have to be machmir on that to not plunge toilets on Shabbos. We saw that many in the Ashkenazi world will do it al yedei shinu. Is one permitted to cut toilet paper on Shabbos if none is available? So we said again that ideally, certainly one should not do that, but if they really needed to for covered up rios, if they cut derech shinoi, right? So they cut it in a strange way, they're doing a rabbinic prohibition in a situation of human dignity, and that would be okay. Remember, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said that even cutting on the lines itself, he didn't think was machatech. He didn't think that was a problem, or Yashiv certainly thought that it was. We said there are those who say maybe B'dafka you should do it on a perversion because you're cutting less. Again, I don't know that that's generally accepted, but it's a fascinating idea, and maybe B'dafka it's better. Yeah, I think it was in the same section, not the very same subsection, but I think it was somewhere near there. About the heter of kavod abrios for toilet paper on Shabbos, a rabbinic prohibition if one needed to. Preferably not to, but if one needed to, they could. Is one allowed to cut a string around a package of oranges or cake? Yes, if that's allowed, that's destructive. You're allowed to do it. Is someone allowed, if someone opened a package illegally on Shabbos, is one permitted to benefit from the contents? So it's technically not until after Shabbos, but remember, if it's a machlokes and there's some opinion that says it's allowed, then you are allowed to benefit from it. And we said in most of these shilas, there's someone who says that it's okay. So most of these shilas, you're probably going to be all right if it was done, but obviously shouldn't be done if you're not allowed to. Okay, everybody hanging in there? Should we keep going? All right, what? Okay, all right. Continue test. Yeah, on to Borair. So what are the three requirements to permit Borair? Also, we know biyad, miyad, ocha mitoch psala. So using your hand without a utensil, taking the good from the bad, and doing it for immediate use. Okay, why do these factors make a difference? We said that they transform it into derech achila as opposed to derech breira. You're no longer doing it in the way that farmers do it. You're doing it in the way of normal people eat. That's not called borer if it's the way that we actually eat. Okay, what is a nafa, kvara, knon, and tamchoy? So a nafa, kvara, two different types of like sifters of sieves, and those are going to be a Torah prohibition if you use. Knon and a tamchoy are, knon is like a funnel, and a tamchoy is like a dish, like a bowl, a plate that was used to help separate things out. There you're using a utensil, but it's not a classic utensil for separating, so that's going to be a rabbinic prohibition of borer.
What's nafa and kavura?
Yeah, those are different types of like sifters, thieves. Oh, those are problems, meaning because those are derech borer, meaning if they're using a sifter, that's what a farmer would do to separate. That's going to be the real Torah prohibition of borer. Oh, exactly. That's all because it's derech achila. It's the way of eating. Okay, that's how we called it. Is one permitted to use a fork to remove a potato from challah the other two criteria of Borair are met. Yes. Well, isn't that using a utensil? It's an extension of your hand. It's not called a utensil. What though about using a fork to sort out lettuce leaves? Let's say I couldn't get these bad lettuce leaves out and I want to use a fork to help me to do it. It assists, it facilitates with the actual separation, not just of extending my hand, but it's being used in that way. So there at Moshe finds because you're not allowed to. In other words, we don't just define every kli. This kli is always allowed, this kli is never allowed. We say it depends how you're using it. A fork for a potato and shallot is fine. A fork as a separation tool for lettuce would not be fine with Moshe thought. However, what would be the argument against Rav Moshe Feinstein's chumrah is not that maybe as Orach Shabbos, and maybe no, a fork is fundamentally not a borer or dika utensil. It's not something that we define as a separating type of utensil, and therefore would never be subject to being considered a kli for purposes of borer. What about a slotted spoon on Shabbos? Anybody remember this one? Can I take it from a cholent? They say it's a big problem. Now, I guess everyone we learn says it's not allowed. There are those who say that it is, but yeah. Oh, so very good. So that was the kula of the Shmir Shabbos Kilchus. It says if you do it quickly, I see Avi laughing because yeah, there are those who are makil, but who say that also. What would be the argument to be makil on it, based on what we've learned?
You don't care.
He says you could do it very quickly. You could do it quickly. Maybe you don't care, or you could say that it's something you bring to the table. Remember, we said that there are opinions that if it's a type of kli that you bring to the table for the act of eating, right before you eat, do you use it? That's not called a borer utensil. A borer utensil means something that's done in the kitchen or in the field, something that's in preparation for the meal that you wouldn't bring out to your guests on the table itself. But the classic example we saw of that would be like a tea kettle, the next question, with a filter on the end. So if you have a filter on the spout, isn't that borer? It keeps the leaves in while it lets the water out. Aren't they using a utensil to separate? So we said it is a utensil. But maybe it's not the prohibited utensil because it's derech achila. Maybe because the tea kettle is something that you bring out to guests at the table. It's not something you do in advance of the meal. Maybe that defines it as the type of utensil that is permitted when it comes to borer, something that you usually bring out to the table. Okay. So the possible to permit would be that because a tea kettle is something that is not a preparation for a meal, but it's something that you do actually at the time of the meal, like you bring it out to the table for dessert, maybe that automatically exempts it from borer. Maybe that makes it that it's considered an eating utensil as opposed to a separating utensil. Separating utensil means in preparation of a meal. That makes sense? Okay, is one permitted to use a pitcher that holds back the ice cubes from falling into the drink? So yeah, so it may depend on the size. So first of all, if you're talking about big ice cubes, we say that's not even considered a mixture, right? Because big ice cubes are so noticeably different from the water around them that wouldn't qualify as a borer mixture that's prohibited. So that would be okay if it's big ice cube. If it's small ice cubes, that the Orach Shabbos said about the size of ice cubes. But then what about, let's say there's smaller ice cubes. So is that a problem? Now the ice cubes are more mixed with the water because they're small ice cubes. They're a little bit less distinguishable. Depends who you ask. What would be the issue? Yeah. So Rav Moshe Feinstein would say it's still a problem because you're using a utensil to facilitate separating one thing from another thing. That's the definition of borer. Others would say that no, if it's something you bring this to the table, it's not something that's done in advance of a meal. And therefore, we don't define this as a borer type of kli that would be prohibited. Yeah, based on the Chazon Ish, you could be lenient there. The other kula, can anyone think of another kula, by the way, for that? Of the ice cubes in the water? Like why we should be lenient? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, most people are not makbid to have the ice cube and the water together, which is another major factor. But assuming that you didn't want them, you're very makbid about that. Is that not what? I mean, most people don't, meaning to have the ice and the water, we want both of them. So remember we said that it's only a problem if you don't want to drink one and you want the other. Yeah. So maybe we wouldn't even call it a mixture of two things. Maybe it's just one thing of ice water. Okay. Is one allowed to use a salt shaker with rice kernels on Shabbos? Yeah. Same thing, exactly. For our purposes on the Bechina, I think they want you to really know Rav Moshe's shita, just to be aware of. So remember, if you see this in Rav Moshe, that the rice kernels is not allowed. We saw Rav Avadia was lenient for Sfardim. So Rav Avadia says yes, but we generally, for Ashkenazim, assume a no. There are others who are lenient also, but Rav Moshe, based on Rav Moshe, would be no. Okay, how soon before a meal must something be sorted to qualify as miyad? So remember, we talked about that there are posting who say a certain number of minutes, like 30 minutes, for example. But the most standard approach, where Moshe said, is hard to say. I can't give you an exact number. It's whatever the standard preparation for a meal is, that's what you should do. So don't prepare and go to shul and then come home and have your meal. That's not miyad. But if you're home already and you're going towards the meal, okay, you don't have to get it to the second, but you want it to try to be leading directly into the meal as best you can without a gap in the preparation. So miyad, again, the answer for us is there's no specific quantity of time. It's more just a practical thing of, I think the Chazon Ish is quoted as having had that, but
Isn't it for the next meal? It's
so
perfect.
it has to be the next upcoming meal, exactly. So it can't be in the morning for Shabbos Shudis. Clearly, it has to be for for lunch in the morning without any interruption. Okay, sorting in order to lend an item to a neighbor considered miyad. Let's say I want to, he wants to borrow a pot. So I take the pot out from a mixture of other pots, and now I'm giving it to him, but he's not using it right this second. Is that a problem? So I said, not a problem. It's okay because my purpose for it is giving it to him, which is right now. However, remember, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said you shouldn't game the system. You could take that and matter anything on Shabbos for Borair with that logic. So he says it has to be that there's some possibility of him using it now. Yeah, so it would be called miyad. If I take this, he wants to borrow a knife, so I'm taking a knife from a pile, but he's not using it right now. But no, I'm using it right now because I'm taking it to give to him. My giving it to him is using it right now. So it is considered miyad. So that's what we said is there has to be a chance at least that he's going to use it. If you know that he's not going to use it now and he could come by later, Shlomo Zalman says, then I don't think you should rely on this because then you could get away with any Borair issue at all. If I want to sort socks for tomorrow morning, I'll just say, I'm sorting them to give to my child for right now. You could get it as a loophole to get around any miyad problem in Borair. He said you shouldn't do that. But under normal circumstances, if your neighbor wants to borrow, you're allowed to give it to him right now. Okay, is one allowed to marinate something in juices hours before it's going to be needed on Shabbos? So you're having lunch 4 hours from now, but you have to start soaking it now. So you separate things in order to soak them. Is that allowed? That's miyad. Why? Because you need that time. There wasn't any way around that, right? If you want to prepare this for lunch, you're going to need to do it 4 hours in advance and let it soak. That 4 hour gap is not called an interruption. That's called connected to the meal. Exactly. Unless if you could have done it before Shabbos, and that's the next question here. Is one allowed to remove a soda can? So let's say you have a mixture of soda cans in a freezer on Shabbos. I'm looking through it to find the Coke specifically, and I take out the Coke. So I took the one that I wanted. I took it by hand, but now I'm taking it out to let it defrost for a long time. So that we said you're not really supposed to do on Shabbos. What's the difference? Why do we say you're allowed to marinate 4 hours before, but you're not marinated, but you're not allowed to defrost this 4 hours before? Because the defrosting for it, you could have done that before Shabbos. You could have had it defrosting already and kept it in the fridge. The marinating, you had to do it this morning in order for it to be fresh. Therefore, if for some reason defrosting the Coke has to be done now, if it tastes better in some way, then you would be allowed to. But assuming that it's something you could have done equally well beforehand, then we're not going to ignore the time gap. Everybody get it? So time gaps are allowed if there was no other way to avoid it on Shabbos. Know that about the soda cans, removing soda cans from a freezer on Shabbos. Okay, are pickles considered a mixture in their juice? So they say, I'd say for everything you should know. Are pickles considered mixed with their juice? No, we said they're clearly distinguishable. With small ice cubes with water, we said that is considered a mixture. That is a mixture because they're blended together more. What's the definition, by the way, of a mixture or not a mixture? Again, it's the shrug. It's hard to tell. You have to look at each case, and the Orchos Shabbos says it's kasha lahagdir. It's hard to define. You have to use seichel and common sense in every case about are these really mixed together or do they retain their independent identities completely? Large matzah balls from soup. Is that a mixture? If I have a spoon with some soup and large matzah balls, then no. Small matzah balls might still be an issue, but larger matzah balls are not going to be considered mixed with the soup. No Borair problem with large matzah balls. What about an item floating on top of another item? So I have, a liquid on the bottom and I have something floating on the top. Can I take the thing from the top and bottom? So we say, yeah, that you're allowed to, for our purposes, we're going to say that that's not considered a mixture, that one is on top of the other, they're not mixed together. Something floating on something else is not going to be considered a mixture for purposes of Borair. Okay, let's say you have a mixture of items, forks, knives, and spoons, and you want to be able to sort them. If they're floating on top of each other, you said? Yeah, I mean, for our purposes, let's assume that if one, I had in mind more like two total different layers. So like a liquid on the bottom and something else floating on the top, not just like a little item. There it might be like if it's carrots or the like. Okay, what about if I have a mixture of forks, knives, and spoons and I want to avoid any Borair issues? What was the suggestion we saw? Spread them all out. And Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman both allowed that. But one of them raised the suggestion, and maybe it should only be if you'd be allowed to be done for someone else. But we hold no, even for yourself, that you're allowed to do it. Okay, what are the various leniencies to? No. I just gave them both there as to know. What are the various leniencies to permit using a water filter on Shabbos, even if you would never drink unfiltered water? Remember, we said that if you would drink unfiltered water, is there anything wrong with filtering water on Shabbos? No, because it's not a mixture for you, right? You drink the whole thing. You're not separating what good from bad, something desired from undesired. But let's say I never drink unfiltered water. So remember, we saw Rav Elyashiv told us, RYSE is Rav Yosef Shalom Elyashiv. He said, why? He said that even such a person who would never drink unfiltered water is allowed to filter it on Shabbos with a Brita. What? No, Rav Elyashiv. Yeah.
Can't see it.
You can't see it, exactly. So there's no noticeable improvement to it. If it's something that the naked eye can't perceive, that's not called Borair on Shabbos. And so that's one heter of why everyone could use a Brita filter on Shabbos, even if you wouldn't drink it unfiltered. And two, he said, is exactly, push comes to shove, everybody would drink unfiltered water if they really needed to. So he says no one is that machmir about it. And so he thought for both of those reasons we could allow a Brita filter on Shabbos. Okay, everybody got that? Two heterim for that. But what about if there are bugs in the water? Let's say that, remember we said now it's not just like, I like filtered water in LA, but no, now there's a halachic potential problem that I would never want to drink these bugs. And they're visible to the eye. They're tiny, but if you look up to the light, you can actually see them. And so many poskim say that it's not allowed. So there, would you be allowed to do it? So remember, if Belsky thought to be machmir. Yeah, he said, no, you're not allowed to. Now, we pointed out that there are those who are mekil, right? Like Rav Schachter was mekil, but for purposes of the Bechina, I think they want you to think of it as machmir. And this isn't clear because there are different opinions, but for our purposes, we're going to say machmir. So again, if it's just impurities in the water that you like it more clean, that we said there's room to be lenient on. But if it's isser, that there are these bugs in the water, there we said you'd probably be machmir, according to at least Rav Belsky, who is the posik for the Bechinas. Yeah, because there you're not makbid. I mean, there you don't care at all about it. But no. The Rebbe says you're not allowed to filter out the bugs on Shabbos for drinking purposes. Exactly. You could exactly, but for drinking, but
from a common perspective, saying that, it's definitely a problem.
Oh, the bugs. Yeah, so he definitely could say that it's a problem to drink, but to still allow you to filter it on Shabbos. Because one of the arguments is maybe Borair is dafka when it comes to physical ochel and psolas. But if it's halachic, meaning if the only reason I don't want it is because of a halachic reason, maybe then that's not called Borair. Yeah, great point. Okay, if removing the peel of an onion, is removing the peel of an onion a violation of taking ochel mitoch psolas? But I'm taking the peel and I'm leaving the onion. Aren't I taking the bad and leaving the good? Why is that allowed? Exactly. The only way to access it is through that. Is the peel of a fruit subject to Borair requirements? And does it depend if the peel is edible? So it depends if it's edible, right? If it's an edible peel, then we assume that it's all one entity. The apple and the apple peel are all one. Though we saw that Moshe actually did seem to distinguish, but the classic way of viewing it, it's all one thing. There's no Borair taking off the apple peel, because you would eat that, you'd eat the apple, it's all one. What about though if it's something that you don't eat? If it's a peel that is inedible, let's say like an orange peel or whatever, so then that is subject to Borair. You're allowed to do it, but you have to adhere to the 3 rules, right? So you're going to take the bad from the good because there's no other option, but you should peel it and have it immediately and do it by hand. Yeah, it does depend if the peel is edible. Is chicken skin subject to the rules of Borair? Yeah, so Moshe Feinstein thought that it's all one. He said that the chicken and the skin is all one min. Removing the skin is not subject to Borair. But the Orchel Shabbos said that in Israel, it is subject to Borair. So again, Moshe Feinstein, he said that in Israel, people don't eat the skin as much, apparently. So it's considered, he was defining it on the national grounds. Maybe, yeah, it may have changed. You're right. Okay, so that's the chicken skin Shiloh, Moshe Feinstein versus the Orchel Shabbos. The lollipop Shiloh, is lollipop subject to Borair if it has a wrapper that's, the wrapper that's stuck to it? Is that called a mixture? Oh, so you're totally right that that's the only way to access it. So that would solve one of the 3 problems. In other words, if we say something is subject to Borair, then we have 3 criteria that we need to meet, right? So if we say it's subject to it, so that means I still need to use my hand. I still need to do it immediately, but we don't have a problem of the onion, right? We don't have a problem of taking the bad from the good. That one we're willing to overlook. Did you get that, Mir? So this would say if it's stuck to it, it is subject to Borair. Right, we saw that it is subject to Borair, the lollipop. Why? Because it's considered a mixture, right? The wrapper and it's stuck to the lollipop. And therefore, does that mean I'm not allowed to eat the lollipop on Shabbos? No, exactly. You just have to fulfill the other 2 requirements. So do it by hand and eat it promptly. If it's stuck, I thought that we do. Read it to me. If it's stuck, exactly. So that's what I'm getting at. I mean, if it's a lollipop where the paper is stuck, I think even a notice to say like, as it's common with lollipops or something. I thought I looked that one up.
If it's not stuck to the wrapper?
If the wrapper is stuck to the candy, as is the case with lollipops, then it's considered a mixture.
No,
So
but what if it's not?
No, if they're 2 clearly separate entities, like the plastic is not stuck to the lollipop, then there's no Borair issue. But we're talking about if it is stuck to the lollipop, and that's the good one to remember. So we say that means it's subject to Borair, so I can eat it. I just have to fulfill the 3 requirements. So I have to use my hand and not a tool, which of course you're going to do. I have to do it for immediate use, which you might not have done otherwise. So you have to, if you take the wrapper off, make sure to eat it soon. And then I have to take the good from the bad. I can't do that here because the bad is surrounding the good. So that's where we say, okay, you can ignore that one. You can take the bad and leave the good because there's no other option. That's the only way to access it. That's what we call the onion principle. Right? Like you could take the peel of an onion, the layers of an onion, because that's the only way to access it. Okay. Is one permitted to remove the pit of a fruit for easier access to the rest of the fruit?
But does that go for the challah tag too, or no?
Challah and the tag, good. So challah and tag, we said that also may potentially be subject to Borair. It's the machlokas. Some poskim are machmir, some are not. But I think the Shemir Shabbos, if I recall correctly, was machmir on. He said that you should try to do it immediately before, but be careful. It says in terms of lechem mishnah. Okay, and try to avoid carrying any letters. Is one permitted to remove the pit of a fruit for easier access to the rest of the fruit?
I'm sorry, why is that not separated?
So some say that it is. Some say that it is. They brought an opinion that thought that maybe it is technically mixed, because it's attached. It's right in there. So it's a chumrah. Right? It's a chumrah.
So is the answer?
Yeah.
It is.
That it would be subject to the rules, so you should take it off promptly before. Exactly. Okay, is one permitted to remove the pit of a fruit for easier access to the rest of the fruit? So again, if I have a peach and there's a pit in the middle, am I allowed to take the pit out as I've been eating fruit? Can I pull the pit out and keep eating? So it depends who you ask. Right? So the Mishnah Berurah had a kula here. The Mishnah Berurah said, Well, it's like the peel of an onion. The only way to get to the other side of the peach is to take out this pit, so now I can eat the rest of it. That's like removing the peel of an onion to get to the onion. So he says that's allowed. No, not subject to Borair. But the Chazon Ish said, like, well, there are other ways to get around it. He said you could just turn the fruit around. So, I ate through part of the peach, and now I have the peel over here, and the flesh of the peach is behind it. The Mishnah Berurah says, yeah, remove the peel so you can get to the rest. Chazon Ish says, no, just turn it around and pull the peach towards you while you hold the pit, and you can take the ochel from the psolas. It's not like a wrapper on a lollipop, or it's not like a peel of an onion, that the only way to access it is by removing the psola. With a pit, you can get around the pit, and you could pull the fruit to you while leaving the pit behind.
So my wife was getting like cantaloupe. How would you do melon cantaloupe? They have those little scoop it.
Yeah. So the easiest thing is to scoop up some of the fruit with it together, and then you avoid the problem, which we're actually going to get to in a second. Oh, in a minute or two. Okay. What are the permissible ways to eat fish with bones on Shabbos? This we're not going to go through each one. I just put it to help us refresh our memory. But take the food, leave the bone. You put it all in your mouth and take the bone out, for example, sucking the flesh off, leaving the bone. A variety of ways. You don't have to be able to list all of them. I just thought for us it's good to know as we move forward to have some conception of that. But what's the origin of eating gefilte fish on Shabbos? To avoid Borair issues. Shmir Shabbos says that's the origin of the minhag. Remember that. The Borair on Shabbos is gefilte fish. Okay, why is one permitted to rinse off fruits and vegetables on Shabbos? So Moshe said that you might not really care, like it's not something you're so makpid on, like many people eat it without necessarily rinsing it off if they had to. And so it's not really an active Borair because you'd eat them together. Like we said, that's not Borair if you'd eat them both. And two, yeah, meaning like if you'd eat both of them together, like we said, if you have water with impurities and you would drink it without filtering it, then certainly filtering it is not a problem. Yeah. But then we said also that Rav Moshe has this chiddush that he says rinsing something under a stream of water, that's an act of rinsing. That's not an act of Borair. He says Borair has to have a certain form to it, and this just doesn't conform to what Borair. This is an act of rinsing off, and he thought that would be allowed. So he gave a few different svaros to allow it. But Shmir Shabbos Kilchas has said that if you have dirt that's really embedded between grapes, like on the inside of the clusters, and there's sort of a lot of dirt, then maybe that really could be a problem to rinse out. Well, if you have, you got it from the farm, but if it's sturdy, but if there's a significant amount there, I believe it is. Then he says you shouldn't. If there's dirt like between the clusters, if you're talking about a little bit on the outside, that's one thing. But if it's really, a lot in the inside, then that would be more of a problem. Okay. Is one permitted to pour off liquid from sediment at the bottom? So let's say I have a liquid and have sediments. I want to pour some off at the top, leaving the sediment at the bottom. We said that's fine. Why? Isn't that Borair? Yeah, well, A, you're taking the good, and B, it's not even a mixture because at the top part is all just liquid. At the bottom, there's an interface between sediment and liquid. So again, if I have a beaker and at the bottom there is dregs and schmutz at the bottom, but I have most of it is just clear liquid, I can start pouring off slowly the clear liquid, leaving behind the schmutz at the bottom, because I'm not separating the two. The clear liquid at the top, exactly, it's not mixed with anything. The liquid at the bottom, maybe we would consider that to be mixed. Okay, is one interesting? We touched on this briefly, but it's important to know. Is one allowed to place wine sediment on a filter on Shabbos? And what about, are you allowed to pour water over wine sediment that was already put on the filter on Shabbos?
No.
So, so it depends. If it's dry wine sediment, that you're allowed to put on a filter because you're not doing anything. It's just putting solid on solid, nothing's happening. That's allowed. But if it's moist sediment that has some wine and some solid in it, and you're putting it on the filter, and now the liquid part, the wine, is going to filter through while the solid part stays on top, that's Borair, right? You're separating the liquid from the solid. That's a problem. So the answer would be to this: are you allowed to pour off liquid? We said absolutely yes. Are you allowed to place wine sediment on a filter on Shabbos? So if it's dry, you're allowed to. If it's wet, you're not allowed to. Is one allowed to pour water over wine sediment on Shabbos? Let's say I have a filter that has dry sediment on it, and I want to take water and pour it through to hit the sediment and then to come through the filter. We said you're allowed to. The Tosfos read. Remember why? Because I started with water, and I ended with water. It just, went through, okay, it picked up a little bit of flavor along the way, but there was nothing tangible that it got. So I started with water, I ended with water below. Everybody get that? That's important to remember these cases of the sediment. Is one allowed to make coffee via the pour-over method on Shabbos? So based on, this was so relevant because then we got to the pour-over method. Yeah, if you put dry coffee stuff on a filter and you're pouring hot water over it, so yeah, you're totally allowed to, right? Because I put the dry coffee. Is dry coffee on a filter a problem? No, it's totally solid. There's no movement, nothing's going through. And now I pour hot water. So I started with water and I ended with water. Okay, it picked up some coffee flavor along the way, but that's not considered. So there could be visual problems. Absolutely, you're right. So there you'd have to use like a kli shlishi, right? According to Rav Moshe, or find ways to get around it. But from a Borair perspective, he said it would be okay. What about the French?
On the pour over, if you had dry grounds on top of wet grounds, would that be a problem?
So if they're wet grounds, you wouldn't be allowed to put them on Shabbos, right? Because if they're wet grounds and you're putting it on a filter, then lichora, some of that it could already begin dripping through. But if it was on from before Shabbos, then seemingly there's no problem.
I made the first cup of coffee, so now the grounds are wet. Now I want to make a second cup of coffee, so I add more dry grounds onto the wet grounds.
Yeah, I think that's okay because you're not putting on. The problem is to put on wet grounds onto the filter. That's Borair. That's
Got it.
To go through. But if it's already there and now I'm just adding water.
Daniel, just be safe. Only have one cup.
French press is where we talked about. It's like you have like a plunger that pushes down. So there's kind of hot water and you push down on the coffee sediment and towards the bottom. So in a nutshell, we said that that's a problem. I won't get into the reasons why for the purpose of Chazara, but remember we said that French press could be a real problem of Borair. So no, that's different. It's different than I pour water and I put water through. It's all mixed together and I'm pushing down the solid and keeping the liquid above. I'm separating them with a plunger. That's a big problem. Okay, how does one define ochel from solas regarding what's poured off and what remains in one's hand? So remember we said the Magen Avraham and the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Anybody remember? Exactly. Shulchan Aruch Harav seems to say whatever remains in your hand, that's what you're taking. That's considered the good from the bad or the bad from the good. And the Magen Avraham says no, whatever actually is poured off, whatever leaves, that's what's considered good from bad or bad from good. So this was relevant when it came to, let's say you have a can of corn. So you open the can on Shabbos. That was the first part of the shir. Am I allowed to open the can of corn on Shabbos? But there are heterians. But now I want to hold the top and pour off the liquid. So is that called pouring out? I'm taking the bad and leaving the good? Or is it that I'm taking the good and leaving the bad? Right? How do we view it? Is what am I taking and what am I leaving behind with the pouring off the liquid and keeping the corn? So the Shulchan Aruch Harav says whatever remains in your hand is what you're taking. So you keep the corn. So that's called, keeping the good, taking the corn and leaving behind the liquid. The Magen Avraham says no, it's whatever you're pouring off. So you're taking the liquid, leaving behind the corn. That's a problem. Okay. What is the Yeah, but we generally hold like the Magen Avraham. So we hold, and even some Lubavitchers hold like the Magen Avraham. That because maybe it's not clear that the Shulchan Aruch Harav really meant
whatever you're pouring off is good.
Yeah, so whatever you're pouring off is considered what you're taking. So and remember in Borair you have to take the good and leave the bad. Okay, what's the machlokas Mishnah Berurah Chazon Ish regarding removing some ochel together with a psolas? Very briefly, Mishnah Berurah says as long as you take a little bit of ochel together with a psolas, now there's no Borair problem. And the Chazon Ish says no, you have to take a significantly more, a substantial portion with it in order to obviate the issue. I thank Ruvain for pointing out to me last time that apparently in Lubavitch they don't accept this at all. It seems like the kula of the tide. But remember we said that if you have a fly in the soup, if you take some of the soup with the fly, that's considered to circumvent the problem of Borair because you're taking the bad with the good, so there's no mixture. So remember, Mishnah Berurah says as long as you take a little bit of liquid, that's okay. The Chazon Ish said you really need to take a lot more generally. But, like a spoon, but you could just pour it all. Interesting. Okay. Is one permitted to perform Borair if he keeps the unwanted item in his hand? So let's say have a box of matzahs and I'm looking for the good matzahs. So I say, okay, here's bad. Let me just take it out. Oh, here's the good one. And now I'm going to put the bad back in. Do we say I just did Borair by put? So we say, no, that's okay. And remember what we compared that to? Rav Shlomo Zalman, he said it's similar to it's not considered bar if you hold on to it. Why? Remember, he compared it to Chazara. Yeah, or it's similar to the cooking thing. Remember, we said if you take the pot off the crock pot, you could put it back on the crock pot because you kept it odo biyado. You kept it in your hand. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then if someone violated Borair,
The answer is not bar.
not Borair, you're allowed to, because you held on to it the whole time. Yeah. If someone violated Borair, may you benefit from it on Shabbos? Same question as we saw before. So technically the answer is going to be no, you're not allowed to benefit from it. But if there is an opinion that said that it was allowed, then you're allowed to benefit from it. Exactly. And then does it help if one remixes a sort of item? So you say, oh, I took the bad out from the good. I took the nuts out from these berries. I shouldn't have done that. So I'm not allowed to eat the berries. Why don't I just mix them back up and then fix it? So he said, no, you can't do it. So Shulchan thought that that's still, once it became prohibited, it's totally prohibited. Okay, last section is the shortest one. Should we still everybody have it in them to finish it? Okay, and am I going too quickly? Are we absorbing it, getting it? I think on Erev Shabbos. Okay, the Siman Shinchap, we'll do this quickly. When it comes to squeezing fruit on Shabbos, everybody else? When it comes to squeezing fruit on Shabbos, what's the Torah prohibition, rabbinic prohibition, and no prohibition at all? Remember, 3 levels of squeezing. What are they? Grapes and olives is biblical. Pomegranates and berries and pretty much everything else that's sort of sometimes squeezed, sometimes not squeezed is rabbinic. And things that are really never squeezed for the juice are going to be totally allowed, like onions or whatever. And we pointed out that nowadays, almost everything is going to be considered rabbinically prohibited to squeeze for its juice. If juice seeps out on it, so good, no problem. So grapes and olives are the only 2 fruit we assume that if you squeeze them, that's a Torah prohibition. And why? Why grapes and olives and not strawberries? Yeah, exactly. That both wine and oil have they have a special status in halacha of wine and oil as opposed to other liquids. They're daraisa. So wine and oil is daraisa to make on Shabbos. Everything else is d'Rabbanan, and the reason why is those 2 liquids are considered to be the most chashuv. They have a unique status in halacha. Okay, if juice seeps out of no prohibition would be something that is like never really squeezed for its juice. So we saw one opinion that holds like lemons might be that, which we do not hold. Certainly Ashkenazim do not hold. But there is one opinion that says maybe nobody squeezes lemons for the juice. Yeah, we do. But if one didn't, and similarly, if they're like onions, wouldn't be considered that at all. I've seen somebody say cantaloupe might be, no prohibition at all. Nobody has cantaloupe juice. Things that are never juiced, except very, very rare circumstances, would perhaps be totally mutter on Shabbos.
And to add on that, we learned because if it enhances the flavor and it's not intended to be juice, that would fit into this category. Because its purpose is just to enhance the flavor of the food.
Interesting. Maybe that's an interesting svara to explain that halacha. Maybe very clever. It's an interesting idea. No, but just because in general we see, dagan tiro shvi yitzar, the Torah always singles out, wine and oil as being maybe, but like pomegranates wouldn't be included, for example. But you're right; they have a certain, yeah. Okay, what about if juice seeps out on its own? Am I allowed to drink I love the examples. It was amazing. These things come up all the time. It's like if you keep your eyes open, you'll see so many instances of what we're learning. That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Nick. So are you allowed to drink the juice?
Yes.
Exactly. We said so generally there's a rabbinic prohibition of mashkin shezavu, but we pointed out that when it comes to olives or grapes, anytime the juice seeps out, you shouldn't drink it because we're afraid you might come to squeeze it. And if you squeeze those 2, that's a biblical prohibition. With everything else, we said that if it seeps out, if the purpose of it was for eating and some juice came out, then I'm allowed to drink the juice because I wasn't meaning to squeeze it in the first place. But if these are fruit that were meant for juicing, and let's say I have a whole pile of oranges that tonight on Motei Shabbos, I'm going to be juicing them, and some of the juice came out now on Shabbos, then I'm not allowed to drink that orange juice on Shabbos because I might come to juice them now. Does everybody get it? So grapes and olives are always prohibited to juice. All other fruit, it depends. If they're for eating, which is 95% of the time what it's going to be, then I'm allowed to have their juice. If they're for juicing, then I'm not allowed to have juice, even if it seeps out on its own. Can you eat grapefruit on Shabbos, knowing you're going to squeeze out the juice? So Shlomo Zalman said yes, because you're not intending to squeeze it. Maybe it's not a psik reisha, it's a shinoi. He gave a combination of reasons, but bottom line, he said you're allowed to, and you could even have the juice in the grapefruit because the grapefruit is for eating, not for squeezing. And therefore, that's a classic example of this principle in action. That if you're not dealing with grapes or olives, which are the most severe, then the juice that seeps out is okay as long as the fruit weren't intended for juicing.
What if you ate the grapefruit and then squeezed the juice of what was left?
Oh, good question. So you're not allowed to squeeze the juice out intentionally. Very good, Joey. So we wouldn't let you actually squeeze it. That's a rabbinic prohibition out of category 2. But if any juice happens to come out on its own, then you're allowed to. Good clarification. Thank you. What about eating grapefruit on Shabbos knowing, okay, we said that. May one drink the juice that collects on the bottom of a fruit salad? Okay, we said again, the fruit salad is for eating. If it's for eating, then the juice that seeps out, you're allowed to drink. What if they're grapes? Dr. Nagel's, thankfully not his case. So is that a problem? So I would have thought it's a problem because we said grapes that seep out, the juice is not allowed. However, we saw that one could employ which principle? Of bittul, right? That there could be a concept of bittul as long as the juice goes directly into the mixture of the other juices. If we assume that it's nullified, then potentially it would be allowed with the other fruit juices. So remember, grape juice and olive juice are going to be the problems, olive oil. But, and if they're by themselves, if you have a basket of grapes and there's grape juice at the bottom, you're not allowed to drink that on Shabbos. If the grape juice is a small component of a much bigger mixture, then there's room to be lenient to small. Yeah, no, so really it should be batal b'shishim. Like it should be, 60. So we're talking about a small, like a big salad with a little bit of grapes in it. Yeah, very good. Okay, is one permitted to suck juice from a fruit that is half in one's mouth? So if you put the whole fruit in your mouth, like can you eat? We say you're not allowed to eat grapes on Shabbos because you're squeezing the juice in your mouth. Of course not. That's called eating. That's not called squeezing. But what if you actually suck the juice out of the fruit? So there we saw the compromise, the Mishnah Berurah, that he said for other fruit will allow you to do it. There are different opinions in the Shulchan Aruch on it and in the Ramah. So he says for other fruit will allow you. So for oranges, you could suck the juice out of the orange, but grapes and olives, again, another example, the fact that they're more serious, we don't want you to well, remember, it doesn't need a kli because we're not talking about Borair, we're talking about dash, exactly. For the rest of them, exactly.
Squeezing is done.
Dash, yeah. It's a tolda of dash, just like extracting the kernel from the husk, but you're extracting the juice from the berry. Okay, under what conditions is a mother allowed to pump milk on Shabbos? It's good to know this one practically as well. So a couple of instances we saw. One is if it could do by hand, but under what circumstances? Like when would she be allowed to do that? Yeah, but even now, when would we allow it? Like we don't let her just under any circumstance use a timer. If the baby's having a problem. So what if formula is available? Would we still allow it? Remember, we still said it's okay. Not everybody agrees to that. Shlomo Zalman thought, I'd be curious another time to ask you, Dr. Nagel, your thoughts on that. But another time. We said that even if there's formula available, if the baby is not going to nurse and you want the baby to be nursing, we'll allow the mother to pump milk on Shabbos for that, according to Shlomo Zalman. Yeah, no, even if you have formula. So I would have said, yeah, formula, don't do a Torah prohibition of dash. Yeah, the baby's not latching. So then exactly, if it's not nursing naturally. So that would be another option if needed. Yeah, if needed, but again, it's still violating a prohibition through, you're attaching it. It's preferable not to if you can avoid it, unless there's specific situations. So one is if the baby's not latching. The other we said is if the mother is engorged. So there, exactly, it has to be completely to waste. You can't collect it and then pour it out. It has to go right either to the ground or into a bottle or a kli that has, something inedible in it, like detergent or whatever. You have to benefit from it. If it goes to waste immediately, then that's not called the biblical prohibition. Exactly. But the key thing is a lot of people mistake that they think pump to catch it and then pour it out a minute later. That's not okay. It has to, the moment it comes out, be gone to waste. It can't have been collected for a purpose. So then if she's engorged, if the baby's not nursing, even if there's formula available, we still said that she's allowed to violate the provision. And then again, so that if there's formula available, if the baby's not latching, we assume that's like pikuach nefesh, and therefore she can violate the Torah prohibition of collecting the milk. If she's in pain, if she's engorged, are we going to allow the Torah prohibition? No, in that case, she can pump, but it has to go to waste, right? And again, better to use the machine. And then the third is, what if her milk supply is going to dry up? If she doesn't nurse and the baby's not able to nurse. So that's another example where we said that she could pump, but it should go to waste. You can't violate the Torah prohibition, but you should violate the rabbinic prohibition for that purpose. Everybody get it? So if it goes to waste, that's the rabbinic prohibition. If it's actually being collected, it's the Torah prohibition. We said you're allowed to collect it if the baby needs to eat, but is not latching on. Even if there's formula available, we'll let you do the Torah prohibition, Reb Shlomo Zalman said. For other cases of pain or other considerations, then you could do the rabbinic violation of having pump and dump, of letting it go to work. Does everybody get that? Okay, that's important. How may a cow be milked on Shabbos to avoid pain for the cow? So we saw three options. What was it? Ask a non-Jew would be preferable. And then what? If a non-Jew is not available? Shinoi, what would be the shinoi? Sort of using a pump, but that you would set on a timer before Shabbos. That would be the next best option. It's not as good as a non-Jew because you're still attaching it on Shabbos before it goes on. But we waive that for Tzar Bali Chaim. Oh, yeah, we're going to get to that in 1 second. Exactly, Avi. Yeah, so option one, best is ask a non-Jew. Option two is set it on a timer, and then you're allowed to attach it to the udders, but do it before it goes on Shabbos. And then option three is you do it yourself, but like you said, Mary, let it go to waste. And again, it's a rabbinic prohibition to pump it to waste, but the rabbinic prohibition will waive in the setting of Tzar Bali Chaim. Okay, what's the difference between mahadrin and non-mahadrin milk in Israel? So it's one of the major differences. Anybody remember?
Not pumped by a Jew on Shabbos.
Is only a non-Jew pumping on Shabbos, milking on Shabbos, but a non-mahadrin, a Jew may have done it on Shabbos. A non-religious Jew may have milked the cow on Shabbos. And we said that there are heterim to benefit after Shabbos from them.
And if it's hooked up to a machine, is that
that would be, I'm not, probably, I think so. I think that the key thing we don't want normally is to have a Jew having done it on Shabbos for us. But if they do, we said there are kulas to rely on to drink non-mahadrin milk. Remember, that's from the first semester of SCP, that if a Jew does malacha on Shabbos, after Shabbos, it becomes mutter under most circumstances. Yeah, exactly. So the person who did it, he can never drink. The person in the dairy farm, that's why you could use non-mahadrin milk. You couldn't drink it on Shabbos, that Shabbos when it was pumped, but obviously that's not going to happen. Only by non-Jews on Shabbos. Exactly. So that was another kula. Very good, Adam. We said that even if you buy non-mahadrin milk, you don't know that this milk was milked on Shabbos necessarily. So it may not have even been done on Shabbos. So that's another room for leniency for non-mahadrin milk. Okay, is one allowed to juice fruit into foods? Can I take a lemon and squeeze it onto fish? Yes. Does the juice have to be fully absorbed into the fish? Does it only work if it gets fully absorbed? So we said no, as long as it's there to enhance the food. Dr. Nego was talking about before. So my salad tastes better with some lemon squeezed onto it. Even though lemon's not getting absorbed, that's okay because it's the tikkun hamaycha. It's for the sake of improving the food. Are there any limitations on this squeezing juice onto solids? Well, if it's enhancing the food, then even if there's more juice, that would be okay. It has to go directly, very good. So you can't do it into a cup and then pour it. It has to go directly onto the food. Exactly. And then the other major leniency we saw that the poskim recommend is because Rabbeinu Hananel denies this chiddush, we say that when it comes to grapes and olives, don't do that. So you shouldn't squeeze an olive onto your fish. You shouldn't squeeze a grape onto your fish because those are the most serious ones. Just like we told you, you shouldn't suck the juice out of them on Shabbos. So too, you preferably shouldn't squeeze them onto foods. That would be the other limitation. Why might one be allowed to squeeze lemons on Shabbos? So what, the lemons, the famous Egyptian lemonade, right, that they loved in Egypt to drink lemonade on Shabbos. Why Why would you be allowed to make lemonade? Isn't that a rabbinic prohibition of squeezing fruit on Shabbos? So we saw two possible explanations. And we said, well, maybe there's something unique about lemon juice, that maybe this whole prohibition of squeezing is when I take a grape and now I have grape juice from it that I could drink. But what if I take a fruit that I squeeze the juice and the juice is totally inedible unless I tamper with it? Yeah, lemon juice, who would want to drink that? It's so sour, you have to add sugar to it. Maybe that wasn't included in this prohibition. And maybe that's totally mutter, to take a lemon and squeeze it into a cup. Any other, because it's inedible, it's so sour by itself, as opposed to grape juice, apple juice, orange juice, or anything like that, that you could drink straight out of the fruit. So that was one argument. The other argument that maybe a little bit more strict. Maybe we won't totally allow you to just squeeze it into a cup, on Shabbos. Maybe you squeeze it into water. Normally, squeezing into water would be a problem, right? To squeeze apple juice into water is not allowed. Squeezing apple onto fish is allowed, but squeezing into liquid is no good. Maybe here that because the lemon juice to begin with is so inedible, maybe we'd allow you to do it into water. So they're two very similar answers. Just one is a little bit more limited than the other. One says it has to be into water. The other one says, no, it's totally allowed. It was never included in anything we're talking about, any prohibition. Okay. Very good. So that was one of the term we found. Is Mishnah Berurah says is what if you take lemon, even for Ashkenazim, you squeeze it onto a sugar cube, so that's solid to solid. That's like taking the lemon onto a fish, which we said is allowed. So to lemon onto sugar cube, and then put the sugar cube into the liquid. That's the way to circumvent it. We saw the Chazon Ish didn't love that idea because he said, it's just circumventing it. But the Lais and Mishnah Berurah said that you could do that. It dilutes it, yeah, but it still hasn't fully fixed it. I think they were assuming that you needed really some sugar or something else, at least in those times, to be able to consume it. But that, according to one opinion. So one opinion says you're only allowed to squeeze it into water. The other opinion says you're even allowed to squeeze it into a cup. And that's how the Rav Avadia passes. He says, like the second opinion, he says the more makil one, that you're allowed to squeeze lemons on Shabbos. They were never included in the prohibition because it's not edible. He said, good to be machmir if you can, but he thought for Sfardim, Me'ikar Hadin, there was room to be lenient. He says you shouldn't do that sugar trick. Yeah, he says no. Yeah, I guess not. I guess, do it onto fish or something, but yeah, not to then with the intent of putting it into a liquid. Oh, so sorry. So Mishnah Berurah says for Ashkenazim, none of this applies. Lemons are just like oranges, like apples. Like we would have assumed if we had never heard this question. We would have assumed they're all we would have thought they're prohibited. We would have thought that lemons are prohibited, just like everything else. But the Yalkut Yosef said that Me'ikar Hadin one could be lenient for Sfardim to squeeze lemons on Shabbos. But even there, I think he concluded that it's better to be machmir. No, Mishnah Berurah says it's awesome. Mishnah Berurah says lemons are just like apples. He says, forget we ever talked about it. Yeah, he said still lemon juice is still prohibited. So according to Mishnah Berurah for Ashkenazim, this question is kind of irrelevant. We say lemons are just like anything else. But for Sfardim, there might be a reason to say lemons are different than apples and oranges on Shabbos because it's inedible. Exactly. Yeah, but I mean that would be true for anything. That'd be true for apples, oranges, exactly. Okay. Unless you do it all onto sugar cubes, which we said is not very practical. But in theory, then it'd be okay. Chazon Ish would still say he doesn't like it because it's destined to go into the water. That's solid going into liquid. Okay. Another one to know: what is the status of squeezing oil, or fat, or water from pickles? Or let's say an oily kugel on Shabbos, you want to squeeze out some of the oil so that you can eat. So you can always you're allowed to squeeze onto food, sugar cubes. So from food onto food, because remember, dash means that I start with a solid and I end with a liquid. That's the problem. So if I take a grape and I squeeze it into a cup, solid, now I have a liquid. But if I take a lemon and I squeeze it onto fish, I start a solid to solid. There was a split second in the air where it was a liquid. We can ignore that split second. So here we say, okay, what if I put it from solid onto solid and the solid is going into a liquid? Is that a problem? Probably not recommended. Okay, what about if you squeeze an oily piece of kugel? You want to get some of the oil out. You want to just squeeze out some of that oil from the kugel on Shabbos. Is that a problem? That dash, is that like squeezing an apple for its juice, an orange for its juice? You're squeezing the kugel for its oil?
No, because you'd eat it anyway.
Exactly. A, you'd eat it anyways, but B, remember we said that these absorbed things, like absorbed fat or oil, that has the status of like pomegranates, berries, category 2. It would normally be a rabbinic prohibition to squeeze it for juice. Let's say I wanted the oil, but for some reason. So then I'm squeezing the kugel for the oil. That's not allowed. That's a rabbinic prohibition, like squeezing an apple, an orange, a grape, a pomegranate, a berry. But if I'm squeezing it just to get rid of the oil, because I want the kugel and I want the oil, I want to get rid of the oil, then we said for these purposes it's allowed, because you're not squeezing it for the juice, you're squeezing it for the sake of the kugel, and that is going to be allowed to do it. So you get it. So squeezing oil from kugel is a rabbinic prohibition if you're doing it for the sake of the oil. But if you're doing it for the sake of the kugel, then that's allowed on Shabbos. Everybody get that? Remember that? Could there be a Borair problem? So that is what Jeff was alluding to. That isn't it Borair? Like I'm taking out I want to get rid of the oil so I can have the good kugel. I'm taking out the bad. Josh, does that? Yeah, you'd probably eat them together, Shlomo Zalman said, if you needed to, and therefore it's not considered a mixture. Some disagree on that, but we assume that could be okay. Very quickly, why is crushing ice into water prohibited on Shabbos? Remember, we saw 3 opinions to Molid. Yes, so Rashi says you're playing God, you're creating something new on Shabbos. You started with ice and now you mashed it up to create water. That's an act of creation. It's rabbinically prohibited. It doesn't fit into Rashi. It's Molid. Doesn't fit into any of the 39 biblical categories, but the rabbi said it's still not appropriate. Rambam says that it resembles mashkin shedava, right? It's similar to, it might lead you to squeeze grapes, right? If you're extracting water from ice, it's kind of like extracting juice from grapes, and therefore we don't want you to do it. It's a rabbinic prohibition for that. Exactly. And then the third one is Sefer Truma. Yeah, it's not likely, but you never know. And then, I just want to make sure we're almost done, but I just want to make sure Jose is also done. So good. And Sefer Truma said third reason why you're not allowed to mash up ice on Shabbos is exactly the result, nolad, that you are now making something new is being created. He's looking more different than molid. It's confusing. Molid is the action, nolad is the result. So the nafkamina, the difference between them is what if it happens on its own? The Rashi would tell you if ice that melts on its own on Shabbos muktzah in Torah. No, it's not, and it's not muktzah. Just the rabbis didn't want you to do an act of creating something, but if it happens on its own, that's fine. The Sefer Truma says no, water is totally different from ice, and therefore you started with ice. Water was born. It changed is different, and it's totally problematic on Shabbos muktzah. So what do we recommend? So Sfardim are makil on that. Sfardim do not treat the melted ice as muktzah. Ashkenazim do treat it as muktzah preferentially. So we say try to treat it as muktzah if you can. If you're in a bind, you can be makil like that. But how do you get around the problem for your Ashkenazi? What should you do for your ice cubes? If you put ice into a bowl to serve it on Shabbos?
And water.
We'll put it near a fire. Well,
A little water in the bottom.
To be mavatel, right? Meaning that if it's going to be melting, then you already have some water in it, and it's not going to be muktzah. But remember, it's going to be like batel. Oh, good question. I think then it's too late. I think then you'd have to have, I think it's dafka when it comes into existence. Yeah, it has to be when it dafka when it comes into existence.
So Sephardic what?
They say ice and water are the same thing. It's not a new thing. It just changed states. Ashkenazim say, you're right, it is the same thing. It's the same molecules, but it's a new state, so it resembles something new. We treat it like, so you avoid it by having a little bit of water in the dish ahead of time. Then any bit of water that melts is instantly nullified in that water. Okay, what are the 2 reasons to permit walking on snow on Shabbos, despite the fact we said everybody agrees you're not allowed to? Yeah, exactly. And it's a semi-muktzah for Ashkenazim, meaning if you're in a bind, the Ramah says you could be lenient. But he says try to be machmir to treat nolad, to treat melting something as nolad on Shabbos. What are the 2 reasons? Does that make sense?
Be lenient by putting it, how would you be lenient? Put it into a cup of water?
Yeah, if you have ice, if you want to put out a bowl of ice on your table on Shabbos, better to have a little bit of water in it and then put the ice in it and then put it out, rather than having a totally empty bowl that you put the ice into, because you have a little bit of water at the bottom. Now, whenever the ice melts, that new ice is getting nullified in the non-muksa water that was there from the beginning. I think just water in the bowl is good enough. Yeah. I
When I
think.
get the ice out of the freezer, I want it's like freezer burn.
Mhm.
Any issues there? I'm putting the ice water in the bowl technically, but the ice came in the bowl first.
I think that's okay because it hasn't started to melt yet. So the key thing is you want it that once it's starting to melt, that it never sees the light of day, so to speak. But the moment it melts, it's entering into the water that was already in the bowl, the non-muktzah water. It nullifies any new muktzah water that's formed, if you will. Okay, what are the 2 reasons to permit walking on snow on Shabbos? Even though we just said you're not allowed to crush ice on Shabbos. When I'm walking, I'm crushing it. Some of it's going to get crushed into water. Davar she'eino mitkaven is one reason. You don't intend it, and it's not guaranteed to happen. Or there's nowhere else to go. Yeah, exactly. There's nowhere else to go. The rabbis weren't strict in that case when you had no other way to walk out of the house. Okay, what is an argument to permit making ice on Shabbos? We said some are machmir. They say just like melting ice on Shabbos for Ashkenazim, the melting becomes the new water is muktzah because it came into existence. So too making ice from water, you started with water, you ended with ice. Shouldn't that be certainly no ladla that it came into existence? Well, starts with water, ends with ice. Shouldn't that be this? We said starting with ice, going into water, Ashkenazim say that water is treated as muktzah. So shouldn't water going into ice also be treated as muktzah, something new created?
It's temporary. It'll go back to its.
Exactly. As Jeff says, it's just Eliezer had an interesting finish. He said they're not the same. Going from ice to water, that's the natural direction. Like it's going to stay as water. So that's a significant change from ice into water, because water will stay like that. Water being put into the freezer to turn into ice, if the freezer ever breaks, if you take it out of it's going to melt, right? The natural state in this climate is for it to be water. So this is a temporary change rather than a permanent one, and you'd be allowed to. And that exactly. And that was the same heter we saw that maybe the Aruch Shabbos said, well, you'd be allowed to make whipped cream on Shabbos, because even though it starts as a liquid and turns into a cream, it's going to eventually melt back into liquidy, and that should be okay. Rav Belsky thought no, that's an act of molding. You start with a liquid and you end it with a cream, and that is an act of creating. Making ice on Shabbos, bottom line is we say preferable not to for Ashkenazim, but if needed, one would be allowed to. There's definitely room to be lenient. There's certainly room to be lenient, but some are not. Exactly. It's the same thing with ice cream. Your Rebelsky is machmir. Rebelsky says you're not allowed to pour whipped cream from a cream. Yeah, no, the big one for Rebelsky is the bugs in the water. He says you're not allowed to have. Yeah, you're not allowed to filter bugs in water. What? Yeah. Okay, so again, Baruch Hashem, we did it. I'm sorry, it's
So the very last one, the Aruch Shabbos is okay?
Aruch Shabbos says it's okay for whipped cream. But if you know all of these things, you will be in very good shape. And any questions, feel free to reach out or to post on the WhatsApp. We can all help each other, Mitzvah Hashem. And most of all, everyone should continue to go Michael El Chayo and to take what we learn with us and on to them. Mitzvah Hashem. Haslach harabah to everybody.